June 6, 1944, marked a pivotal moment in the history of World War II. Early that morning, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious assault in history, with over 150,000 troops landing on the beaches of Normandy, France. However, at Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, located in the dense forests of East Prussia, the initial hours of the day passed in an eerie calm. At this time, Adolf Hitler remained unaware of the full scale of the invasion that was about to change the course of the war. The German leadership, although aware that an invasion was imminent, had been deceived by the Allies' elaborate disinformation campaign, particularly Operation Fortitude. The campaign had convinced Hitler and his generals that the main Allied assault would occur at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. This deception had placed the German forces in a vulnerable position, with their reserves and key reinforcements tied up at other locations. While the Allies had successfully misled Hitler into believing Normandy was merely a diversion, the reality on the ground was very different. At approximately midnight, Allied forces began their airborne assault, with more than 23,000 US and British paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropping behind the Utah and Omaha beaches. Their mission was to secure critical causeways and disrupt German communications. Meanwhile, a further attack came from gliders carrying light armor, aiming to support the airborne units. These troops began to scatter the German forces, causing confusion and disarray among the defenders. However, the chaos on the ground was not immediately acknowledged by Hitler or his command. Despite the unfolding invasion, Hitler continued his typical evening routine. The previous night, he had engaged in a late tea session with guests such as architect Hermann Giesler, discussing films and sharing anecdotes from World War I. Hitler retired to bed around 3 a.m., following a routine where he would often sleep for 10 to 12 hours, sometimes with the aid of sedatives, to manage the tremors and other symptoms of his declining health. His aides, including his loyal valet Heinz Linger, were under strict orders to refrain from waking him unless absolutely certain of an emergency. As a result, Hitler slept soundly, unaware of the devastating events unfolding just hours away in Normandy. During these early hours, the German High Command at OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or High Command of the Armed Forces, began receiving fragmented reports. Radar and radio intercepts detected massive Allied air armadas of more than 11,000 aircraft heading toward France. However, the response from German commanders was initially one of confusion. Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations, and Wilhelm Keitel, the head of OKW, debated whether the reports indicated a full-scale invasion or just a feint. They assumed it was the latter, due to the ongoing deception operations such as Operation Fortitude, which had convinced them that the Allies would land at Pas-de-Calais. No immediate alert was sent to Hitler, as his generals remained hesitant to disturb him over what seemed to be a false alarm. At 5 a.m., the naval bombardment began, with more than 5,000 Allied ships opening fire on the German defenses along the coast. German coastal batteries, such as those located at Longues-sur-Mer, retaliated briefly, but were quickly silenced by the firepower of the British battleship HMS Warspite. The weather conditions, overcast and windy, further complicated the situation for the Germans. The stormy conditions, which had grounded the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance flights, had also played a role in the Allies' decision to proceed with the invasion, despite the less-than-ideal conditions. The Allies, particularly General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had taken a gamble with the weather, and it paid off as the Germans underestimated the possibility of an invasion in such conditions. Meanwhile, Hitler continued to sleep in his Spartan bedroom bunker at the Wolf's Lair, unaware of the critical developments taking place. His headquarters remained eerily quiet, as staff members, many of whom had been briefed on the incoming threat, hesitated to wake him. The atmosphere was tense, but there was an underlying sense of disbelief that the invasion could be real. The personnel at the Wolf's Lair were aware of the deception, but had no way of knowing the full scale of the Allied assault. Staff members, such as Linger and Hitler's adjutant, Nicholas von Below, later described the situation as a mixture of nervous chain-smoking and whispered discussions about ghost armies, an allusion to the Allied efforts to create false fronts and mislead the German High Command. By dawn, the first reports of the landings had begun to reach OKW. These reports confirmed that the Allies had launched their amphibious assault on the Normandy beaches. The situation was becoming clearer, but it was still not recognized as a full-scale invasion. German commanders, including General Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of Army Group West, began requesting the release of armored divisions such as the 21st and 12th SS Panzer divisions, which were stationed near Caen. However, these requests were delayed by the command structure, as the final decision rested with Hitler. At approximately 6:30 a.m., the first waves of Allied forces stormed the beaches. US forces landed on Utah Beach with relatively light resistance, suffering only 197 casualties. At the same time, the US forces landing on Omaha Beach, later dubbed Bloody Omaha, encountered much heavier resistance, resulting in more than 2,000 casualties. The German 352nd Infantry Division manned the defenses on Omaha Beach, and their bunkers caused massive casualties for the attacking US forces. By 9 a.m., 20,000 Allied troops were ashore, but the fighting on Omaha Beach remained intense. As these critical events unfolded, Hitler remained asleep in the Wolf's Lair, oblivious to the reality of the situation. His aides, fearing repercussions for alarming him unnecessarily, continued to delay waking him. Meanwhile, the German leadership remained in the dark about the scale of the invasion, with high-ranking officers still debating the situation. General von Rundstedt's request for panzer reinforcements was stalled, as Hitler's decision-making process continued to be hindered by his personal habits and his reliance on misleading intelligence. While Hitler slept, a slow build-up of Allied forces continued. The situation on the beaches grew more dire for the Germans as more and more troops, tanks and supplies were unloaded onto the beaches. By 8 a.m., the Allies had landed more than 20,000 troops, and the first significant breakthroughs on the beachheads were beginning to occur. Despite these mounting reports, Hitler's personal refusal to wake up, coupled with the failure of his military leadership to decisively act without his approval, allowed the invasion to progress uncontested. In the late morning hours, as the sun rose higher in the sky, the number of troops ashore grew rapidly. Reports were streaming into OKW, and there was little remaining doubt that this was indeed the long-anticipated invasion of Western Europe. But for the moment, Hitler remained oblivious to the gravity of the situation. His command structure, paralyzed by indecision, failed to mount an effective response in the crucial early hours of the invasion. Hitler's failure to act decisively would set the stage for one of the most catastrophic strategic blunders of the war. By noon on June 6, 1944, the scale of the invasion had become undeniable. The Allies had secured significant beachheads along the Normandy coastline, and the first waves of reinforcements were already landing. The beachheads at Utah, Omaha, and Juneau had stabilized, though heavy fighting continued, particularly on Omaha Beach, where the German defenses were proving stubborn. Despite over 4,000 casualties among the Allies and the growing tide of troops pushing inland, Adolf Hitler had remained asleep, unaware of the rapidly changing situation. His routine was only disturbed as the clock neared noon, when finally he was awakened and briefed on the catastrophic turn of events. When Hitler stirred from his sleep around noon, he was greeted with a world that had changed drastically since he had retired the night before. The reports that flooded into his headquarters were both urgent and overwhelming, but the message remained unclear. Was this the full-scale invasion or a diversion, as had been suggested in the misleading intelligence reports he had so firmly trusted? It was at this point that Hitler was briefed by his operations chief, Alfred Jodl. The briefing included details about the airborne drops, the amphibious assaults, and the growing number of troops ashore. Jodl reported that, according to initial intelligence, Allied forces had landed in force along the Normandy coast. However, the sheer magnitude of the operation still did not register with Hitler. He had been convinced for months, due to the elaborate deception operation conducted by the Allies, that the main thrust would come at Pas-de-Calais. Despite this clear misjudgment, Hitler's reaction was not one of alarm or panic. In fact, his response was a strange mixture of euphoria and disbelief. When Jodl briefed him on the situation, Hitler clapped him on the shoulder and exclaimed, "The news couldn't be better." To him, the long-awaited Allied invasion had finally arrived, and he saw it not as a disaster, but as an opportunity to decisively engage the enemy in what he believed would be a battle that would crush the Allies once and for all. Hitler's optimism was not rooted in the facts on the ground, but in his unfounded belief that the German forces were still capable of repelling the invaders. However, there was a fundamental flaw in Hitler's reasoning. He saw the invasion as a diversion, a calculated move to draw German forces away from the real threat, which he assumed would come at Calais. This belief, fueled by months of deception, meant that he dismissed the invasion in Normandy as little more than a tactical maneuver. Hitler's reluctance to face reality stemmed from both his overconfidence and his rigid, centralized command structure. He could not, or would not, believe that the Allies had truly committed to the invasion of France, and he failed to see the broader strategic picture. In the moments following the briefing, Hitler's actions would demonstrate both his detachment from reality and his failure to act swiftly. As his staff, including his military advisors and generals, began to scramble in response to the growing crisis, Hitler ordered that counterattacks be initiated. However, he also delayed the commitment of crucial German reserves, including the panzer divisions stationed in the area. These panzer divisions, such as the 21st and 12th SS Panzer Divisions, were among the most powerful units in the German military. However, Hitler, fearing that the Allies had established air superiority, delayed their deployment, unwilling to expose them to Allied fighter bombers in daylight. This hesitation would prove to be a critical mistake. As Hitler's decision-making process unfolded, it became clear that his focus was on maintaining the illusion of control rather than responding to the realities of the battlefield. His delay in ordering the release of panzer reinforcements had devastating consequences. By the time the German forces had been ordered to mobilize, the Allies had already established secure beachheads with more than 90,000 troops ashore by the afternoon. The delay gave the Allies time to consolidate their gains and reinforce their positions, making any subsequent German counterattacks much less likely to succeed. At this point, the atmosphere in Hitler's headquarters had shifted dramatically. The previous calm had given way to a rising tension as more reports poured in from the front. Despite the growing sense of urgency, Hitler remained somewhat detached, unwilling to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. His staff, including Jodl and Keitel, worked feverishly to assess the battlefield and send orders to the front lines, but they were hampered by the bureaucratic structure and the overbearing influence of Hitler's personal control over military decisions. One of the most telling moments during this period came when Hitler, still unable to fully accept the scope of the invasion, gave a curious remark. According to reports, when Hitler was informed of the number of Allied troops that had landed, he expressed relief, not alarm. His reasoning was that, although the Allies had landed, they were now stuck without ports, unable to bring in sufficient supplies to sustain their operations. This belief, which was rooted in Hitler's fixation on the strategic importance of port cities, demonstrated his failure to understand the Allied capability to supply their forces through alternative means, such as the innovative Mulberry harbors that would be used to unload supplies. At the same time, the German High Command was pushing for a more aggressive response. Reports from General von Rundstedt, the commander of Army Group West, emphasized the need for immediate counterattacks. Yet, despite these urgent calls for action, Hitler remained focused on his own interpretation of the invasion. Even as the Allies pushed further inland, Hitler continued to believe that the threat could be neutralized with minimal German effort. As the afternoon wore on, and more reinforcements arrived on the beaches, Hitler's frustration began to build. He was still convinced that the Allied forces were vulnerable, that their invasion could be crushed with the right tactics. His optimism, however, began to give way to a sense of irritation. He believed that the invasion was somehow an insult to Germany's military might, and that it was being prolonged by what he perceived as incompetent German leadership. Hitler's frustration boiled over in private, where he could be heard ranting about traitors in the military and the failure to respond effectively. Despite his growing irritation, he made no significant changes to his strategy. By this point, it was clear that Hitler's failure to act decisively had already begun to have a profound impact. The Allies had secured vital positions along the beaches, and the momentum was shifting in their favor. As the German forces remained disoriented, the Allies continued to pour in troops, vehicles and supplies, securing their footholds in Normandy. By the time the afternoon of June 6, 1944 had arrived, the Allied invasion in Normandy was no longer in doubt. The beachheads had been established with overwhelming success, and the scale of the operation continued to unfold. While Hitler's command at Wolf's Lair remained ensnared by his delusions and indecisiveness, the Allies pressed their advantage, landing more than 150,000 men by nightfall. Despite this, the German response remained lethargic and disjointed, a direct result of Hitler's failure to appreciate the situation and his delayed orders. In the afternoon, the reports from the front became increasingly grim for the Germans. The US Rangers had scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, successfully neutralizing the German gun positions that threatened the landings. British and Canadian forces at Sword and Juno beaches linked up, consolidating their gains. The Germans had tried to mount counterattacks, notably with the 716th Static Division, but their efforts were futile. Lacking armor and struggling with disorganized responses, these units were easily overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and momentum of the Allied invasion. Meanwhile, Hitler continued to withhold the full commitment of German reserves, which were still within striking distance of the beaches. The critical panzer divisions, including the 2nd Panzer Division stationed near Rouen, remained held up, awaiting Hitler's approval. The decision to release these forces was delayed until the afternoon, well past the point at which they could have been deployed effectively. Hitler's reasoning, based on a misplaced belief that the Allies' logistical problems would prevent them from advancing further, was grounded in a fatal miscalculation. As the hours passed, the Allies began to solidify their positions and push inland. The first V-1 flying bombs were launched from German-held territory in a futile attempt to retaliate against London. However, these missiles, which were in their infancy as a weapon, caused little damage and did nothing to alter the course of the battle in Normandy. The German response, such as it was, lacked the coordination or the offensive strength to push back the Allies, whose supply lines were steadily expanding with the arrival of troops and equipment. At the Wolf's Lair, the atmosphere had shifted from the initial euphoria that Hitler had displayed earlier in the day to a growing sense of frustration. As reports continued to trickle in, it became increasingly clear that the situation was slipping out of control. Despite the steady arrival of Allied reinforcements, Hitler's mind remained fixated on the notion that this invasion was simply a diversion. His orders, while swift in some respects, were too little, too late. The panzer units once released began their movements, but the daylight hours were against them. German tanks and armored units suffered heavy losses to Allied air power, as fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt and Hawker Typhoon took full advantage of their dominance in the skies. The delay in mobilizing German forces had allowed the Allies to create a solidified front. With over 90,000 soldiers ashore by mid-afternoon and supplies beginning to flow through temporary harbors, the Allies were in a strong position to hold their gains and expand their beachheads. This was compounded by the fact that the German units at the front were often ill-prepared and poorly equipped to mount any significant resistance. Many of the divisions facing the Allies were weakened, with several units being composed of non-German soldiers, such as the Osttruppen, Eastern soldiers, many of whom were Soviet POWs forced into service. At approximately 2 p.m., Hitler, still isolated from the urgency of the situation, engaged in a conference with his senior military advisors. While he had initially greeted the news of the invasion with enthusiasm, by this time his frustration was becoming evident. The German command structure, caught in the web of his indecisive leadership, continued to struggle with the challenge of organizing a coherent defense. Hitler's orders for counterattacks were vague and lacked the necessary coordination to form an effective response. By this time, the Allies had already established a strong foothold in Normandy, and the Germans were in the early stages of a defensive retreat. The confusion at the Wolf's Lair was further compounded by the delay in communication between the various military branches. Although General von Rundstedt had requested the release of panzer forces early in the morning, these orders were either delayed or misunderstood by the senior officers at the front. With each passing hour, the likelihood of a successful German counteroffensive diminished. The lack of cohesive strategy from the German High Command, combined with the growing Allied presence on the beaches, had already tipped the balance in favor of the invaders. As the day wore on, Hitler's reaction to the ongoing events at the front became increasingly erratic. By late afternoon, as the German forces began to lose ground, he began to rant about traitors and blamed his generals for their failure to act swiftly. His anger was directed primarily at those who had failed to release the panzer divisions in a timely manner, but it was clear that the deeper issue was his own refusal to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. His military advisors, meanwhile, were trying to formulate a response, but the slow and disjointed communication between OKW and the frontline commanders meant that no coordinated counter-offensive could be mounted. By the time evening arrived, the situation had become increasingly dire for the Germans. The Allies had secured the beaches and were pushing further inland. While Hitler continued to hold on to the belief that the invasion was a feint, reports confirming the permanence of the beachheads were beginning to filter in. At approximately 6 p.m., Hitler hosted a reception near Salzburg, where he tried to project calm and confidence in front of diplomats. He even expressed a degree of satisfaction that the long-awaited confrontation had finally arrived. "It's begun at last," he declared to his guests, seemingly oblivious to the scale of the disaster unfolding in Normandy. By evening, as more and more reports confirmed that the Allies were entrenched along the coast, Hitler's optimism began to turn to irritation. His earlier euphoria was fading, and he began to blame everyone but himself for the situation. In private, Hitler ranted about traitors in the military who had failed him, but his anger did nothing to reverse the tide of the invasion. The Germans, once able to delay the invasion with tactical resistance, had now lost the initiative. As night fell on June 6th, the reality of the situation was undeniable. The German forces had failed to stem the Allied assault, and the situation in Normandy was rapidly slipping out of control. The failure to act decisively in the early hours of the invasion, compounded by Hitler's refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation, marked the beginning of the end for Germany on the Western Front.